enjoyed Brian's class and learned a lot, and a lot of furniture makers are afraid to try these techniques that we talk about in the book, the chemicals and dyes, but I loved the results that I saw in the class, on the samples and whatnot, so I practiced a little bit and jumped in and did it, and people always, on the pieces that I've done in my house, the furniture pieces, they'll say, oh, this is fantastic, and I swear half the time it's just because, I've done something with it. I've treated the wood a certain way, and it just makes it look, particularly with the walnut, because sometimes the walnut I found is sometimes it'll turn a little grayish, or it'll have a pinkish cast to it, and the boards don't quite match up. And I'm a big fan of the potassium dichromate on the walnut. And one thing I love about turners is that, from what I've seen in our program, is they are more, I'm not a turner, they're more adventurous in terms of with coloring wood compared to furniture makers. And Amy is one of the few people, Amy was ahead of me in this, in coloring her wood. And people would, oh, here's your piece, and then it's, whoa, because she's not afraid to use dyes, and it's intimidating because you feel like you've put all this time in, as you have with turning too, and it's like, I could just wreck it so easily with, putting color on it. But anyway, but in our book, I made a huge mistake today. We have all the samples from our book. We have about 100 samples. I guess I was not on top of my game today because I brought everything but the samples. And when you see the samples, the advantage of them is that, we can talk, you can look through the book and you see, oh, this is, okay. But it's not until you see all the samples laid out, and we have them, like here are all the maple, samples, and they're in rows with all the wood species one way, and then the coloring, by coloring process another way. So you can just really see the many ways that, a wood can turn color, and Brian will tell you how that happens with the chemicals. And it just is much more visually, you just get it a lot more than you do from glancing through the book. So, but one thing I have noticed too is that turners seem to use a lot of synthetic dyes, which I also like. And so there are some interesting things too that you can do, some of our process, grain filling and, glazes and wire brushing and whatnot. And if you were going to go, to just enhance it even further. So here's Brian.
Thanks, Marci. So, unlike everybody in the room here who are woodworkers to varying degrees, I'm not a woodworker. I've never made anything before, but what I am is a professional wood finisher, and I have been for 31 years now. I've been self-employed for 31 years. I started in the industry, the paint and finishing industry, in 1975. I was 20 years old going to college at Trade Tech, and had to have a full-time job because I couldn't afford to do just school. So I worked in a family-owned paint store in Reseda, California, and they carried a lot of old world finishing supplies because a lot of their clientele had immigrated from Europe either pre-World War II or post-World War II. And so they had a lot of these things there, and I talked to a lot of these gentlemen that came in to buy things from us, and they were classically taught in Europe because they were all trained. So I was very curious, so I would ask them a lot of questions, and since I was curious, they were all too happy to share information with me. Fast forward about 6.5 years later, I couldn't get a job in the field I was going to go into, and I thought, I really like the paint and finishing industry. If I'm going to stay in this industry, I should really learn the trade side as well. So I quit and went to work for different contractors who I sold to over the years. Then in 1987, I found myself out of a job on a Friday after involving myself in a labor dispute that had nothing to do with me. So the contractor who was firing a friend of mine goes, "You can join them." And I was like, I hadn't quite anticipated that. I had one job I was going to do. And I called the people up and said, my schedule freed up and I can be there Monday. One job led to another job, which led to another job. I found myself in 1988 restoring a house in Hollywood, and that particular client was a big-time collector of Gustav Stickley, Green and Green. I met Randall Mackinson at the time, who was the former director of the Gamble House in Pasadena. And I ended up getting to do the exhibit at the Huntington Library, the Green and Green exhibit in 1990 with Jim Apexian, master woodworker. 1995, fast forward a few more years, I had the opportunity to bid on the Robert R. Blacker house. So I restored the complete exterior and interior of that house from 1995 to 1997. It's just been really one thing after another. I was in the right place at the right time, but I always tell the class that I teach at Cerritos, I said I never blew any opportunity that came my way. You know, I said you have to follow through and be committed, and I've worked really hard to learn everything I've learned. And fast forward to meeting Marci at Cerritos College. She took my class. She said, I'm surprised nobody's ever written an article about you. I said, I'm not that interesting, really. She goes, no, but what you do is really interesting. I said, okay, I'm not offended by that, but I'm good with that. So she read an article about me for the LA Times, and this premise came about. I grew up in Granada Hills. I hadn't been by the old house in a lot of years, and about 6 years ago I decided to drive through the old neighborhood, and I was going home. I live in Valencia. It hadn't changed much, and as I go around the corner, I see this brand new Craftsman house being built from the ground up. Well, I'm a nosy guy. I see a gentleman wearing a tool belt, thinking he's either the general contractor or, you know, the finished carpenter, and he turns out, he goes, I talked to him and I said, you know, I'm sorry, this is really interesting to me. And I said, are you the owner? He goes, no, I'm actually, my son's the owner. We're building this house together. I'm an amateur woodworker. I have a shop out back. And so I told him who I was. He goes, wait right there, don't leave. He runs in and gets his son. They come out and they take me on a tour of the house. They had gotten all the wood from a company called The Reclaimer out in Sylmar. It was all old Douglas fir that they remilled. It was from a bakery in downtown LA, and so they remilled everything. They built all the doors, windows, all the staircase, everything. And so they go, we have all this wood, but we don't know how to finish it. And I said, well, isn't this your lucky day? So they showed me a book on the Gamble House and on Green and Green, and they go, we really like this color here. I said, I'll tell you what I'll do. Give me some off-cut samples, and I'll work out the formulations for you. So I did. And I went and showed them. I showed them how I did it and where I buy my dyes from. And so every couple of weeks they'd call me up and they'd be stuck on something. I'd stop by and help them out. And so I told Marci, I said, I think this is the premise for a good article. Father and son building this Craftsman house together. The more interesting thing is they were a young family. They were living in a 400 square foot guest house. They had three kids at the time, and she was pregnant with the fourth. Well, their marriage survived that, so that's a pretty solid marriage.
Did you know what caused it?
Yeah, I asked him, do you know what causes this? And he said, I think so. So anyways, that was the article that Marci wrote, and it ran, it was like a 5-page article. It ran in the Times on a Saturday. It was pretty successful, so that's how I met Marci at school. And I've had an amazing career. I worked on many, many Green and Green homes. I restored a lot of them. I worked on a Frank Lloyd Wright, a Lloyd Wright house over here in Los Feliz. I worked on a lot of mid-century modern as well. I'm currently working on a John Lautner house here in La Crescenta. It's only a couple of blocks away, actually. And so we decided to write the book together. I called Marci up in, I think, the summer of 2015, was it? I was up drinking wine up in Santa Ynez Valley, and I see somebody here has this stand made out of Quintessa, which is a wonderful wine, by the way. Anyway, so I called Marci up and I said, Marci, how would you like to write a book together? And she goes, well, what's the subject matter? I go, quantum physics, of course. You know. What do I know about? I know about wood finishing. That's what I know about. So we wrote the book, and it took us about a year to write the book. And the publisher about another year to condense everything and put it all together, and so we have it here for you today if you'd like to purchase a copy. So in my business, I have 5 full-time employees. My lead man has been with me 31 years. He came to work for me when he was 20 years old. I'm the only job he's ever had. The other 4 guys have been with me from 16 years and then 13 years. So I'm really good to the employees. I treat them the way I always wanted to be treated when I was coming up through the trades myself. And so they don't want to leave because I pay them a good wage. They've almost always gotten 40 hours every week. From anybody that knows anything about the construction industry, it's a really hard thing to do, to get 40 hours every week. And I've been so fortunate to get to do the work that I've done over the years, and they feel fortunate getting to work on the projects that we do together, and they really understand it. So in the book, I use a lot of dyes. Some of them are synthetic dyes, like Arty dye, trans tint dyes. Maybe a lot of you have used trans tint or Mohawk dyes. All very good dye makers. I use another one that I get from Germany. It's a powder dye it's from the Articol company. And that's available at highlandhardware.com. In the book we have color samples, and unfortunately we didn't bring our samples today, but we do have color samples with formulations on how to replicate everything that I've done, and that's the premise of the book. I wanted to have a book where people could actually replicate everything in there, and I use some older techniques as well, some old world plant dyes. If you've ever heard of things like logwood extract or Brazilwood extract, these are dyes that comes from plants and trees. They take the bark and pulverize it. There's a technique in the book where I show you how to ebonize wood, where you can take a piece of maple and make it look like ebony. Nick, you took my class, and I'm pretty sure we did that in our class as well. So what I thought I would do is maybe just open it up for a little Q&A, if that's good with everybody. If you have any finishing questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Clear coat finish questions too. Clear coat finish questions
Clear coat finishes, yeah.
as well.
So one of the simplest and easiest finishes to use, and maybe a lot of you have used them, antique oil, right? Watco oil. Does anybody know what those products actually are?
They're a combination of varnish and mineral spirits.
And typically boiled linseed oil, because it's the least expensive of the drying oils. So that's what they do, because in 1975, Watco was made right down in Santa Monica on Lincoln Avenue on the 10 freeway. And they would mix varnish, typically gloss, boiled linseed oil, so they convert the varnish into a penetrating finish versus a film finish that sits on the surface, and then they thin it down with a little bit of paint thinner. And that's what you're buying. When you buy things like Watco makes teak oil, it's not like they're extracting that oil from teak wood. All it is varnish, linseed oil, paint thinner. They put this beautiful label on it, like it comes from Scandinavia, and it has absolutely nothing to do with the Danish at all. It's just a simple three-part oil, which you can make yourself for pennies on the dollar.
Why do they call it boiled linseed oil when it's not boiled?
It isn't actually boiled, you're right. What they used to have before boiled linseed oil was available was raw linseed oil, which you can still buy. Raw linseed oil takes several days to dry in between coats. So what they found out is they could put heavy metal dryers in them, cobalt, manganese, and actually accelerate the drying of it. So the way oil finishes work, whether it's boiled linseed oil, raw linseed oil, pure tongue oil, Watco oil, antique oil, the drying oil absorbs oxygen into the film, and it actually dries to a semi-solid. Mineral oil, on the other hand, is a non-drying oil. So let's say you make a cutting board and you decide, well, I don't care what Brian Miller or anybody else says, I'm going to use mineral oil because I know it's not toxic. So you put the mineral oil on several coats, maybe you wet sand it, which is what I like to do when I'm doing oil finishes. I'll put one coat on one day, let it dry, then I'll come back the next day and put a very heavy coat, and I'll take 1500 grit wet and dry sandpaper and actually wet sand the oil. So after the first coat of oil goes on, what happens is the wood fibers dry and they stand up like whiskers would. And so when you put the next coat on and wet sand it, you get a 2-for-1. You can smooth it out and you're actually pushing that oil into the wood, wipe that excess off, and then apply another coat the next day or the day after, however many coats you wanted to put on. So what they would do with raw linseed oil is, back in the day, they would actually heat the oil up. They would put it in a hot bath of water, and what that would do was kick off the accelerating time and make it cure a little bit quicker. So So they call it boiled, that actually isn't boiled at all. So then you have your simple oil finishes. The downside to oil finishes, they only provide a moderate amount of protection because the wood's still porous. If you pour a glass of red wine on a table that you've done with an oil finish, guess what? A portion of it's going to be absorbed into the surface because it's not going to repel it 100%. When you have a film finish, nitrocellulose lacquer, polyurethane single component varnish, alkyd varnish, those are finishes that build on the surface one coat on top of the other, which requires also with varnish finishes that you lightly sand between coats to where the next coat will adhere to it. Whereas, how many people have ever sprayed lacquer in the room before? How many people don't like to spray lacquer? Yeah, well, that's a lot of people, right? This stuff's nasty. You know, you got to wear a respirator. Except for when I was training, though, there was a couple of these. This one contractor I worked for, his father was a retired painter. He'd come out because he could do beautiful lacquer work. He wouldn't run a respirator. And he smoked. So he'd be spraying with a cigarette in hand. I'd run out of the room. He's like, you worry too much. I said, you don't worry enough. They're crazy. He goes, well, I'm 81 years old. And I said, you may not be 82 if you keep this up. But lacquer it's nasty stuff. You know how they make lacquer? So they take the cellulose resin, right? Wood pulp, right? Cotton fibers. They introduce it to nitric acid, sulfuric acid. They add a fast evaporating solvent like lacquer thinner, or now in LA County, acetone. They put plasticizers to give it some elasticity. So it only stands to reason this stuff is highly flammable. So you don't want to be spraying in your garage with your water heater right there and get a big lacquer cloud. And you can test out your insurance policy really quick that way. So lacquer does require that you have spray equipment to do it with. The good thing about lacquer is it dries very quickly. You can get something finished, typically in good weather like today, you can get it done in a day. Let it maybe off gas for a day. And then you have a finished product. Lacquer also melts into itself, just like shellac does. So you get a very, very good bond because it chemically melts in. So you don't have to sand between coats. I typically do because I've never been able to work in a clean enough space to where you don't have some fallout that gets into the film when it's wet. But the good thing about lacquer is it does dry so fast that you get very few dust particles in it. So then I use a lot of varnish films as well. Single component urethane varnish. Now the problem in Los Angeles County is now, guess what, you can't buy those products. Since 2007, they outlawed those products. That's probably for you. So what I have to do is I just go to either Ventura County or San Diego County and I buy them and I still store them and keep them at home because, look, I'm all too happy to switch over to waterborne when the technology gets good enough and it will perform to the degree that solvent-based finishes do, but right now they just don't. So I'm still using single component urethane varnish that I buy up in Oxnard. And then you have two-stage finishes, which you have your varnish in one container and your acid catalyst in another, and you add the two together, and you typically have what they call a hot life of about 4 to 6 hours, depending on who the manufacturer is. These products have to be sprayed, but they're very, very durable. So if you're doing a kitchen and you want a very durable finish, even more so than a single component polyurethane, maybe the dual catalyzed version is a better way to go. So, questions, anybody? Yes?
Yeah, you mentioned Stickley,
Mm-hmm.
and he gets that wonderful, beautiful, glowing brown color, and I've heard that you do that with ammonia and stuff.
Yes.
What is the process?
Okay, so here's the process when you fume wood. We actually have samples in there in the book that we did do that. Certain woods will contain tannic acid. They're just naturally in the wood. Oak is rich in tannic acid, redwood, mahogany, cherry. You take 27% strength ammonia like they use for making blueprints with. You put it in a non-reactive container, glass or plastic. You have your piece of, maybe a small piece of furniture here. Let's say we're fuming this. I would make a tent, maybe screw some 1-bys to the end of my table, drape plastic over it, tape it around the perimeter of the table, cut a slit in and put the ammonia in either end of it. seal it back up, and what happens is the off-gassing ammonia reacts to the tannic acid in the wood, and it changes the color chemically. So they would use that for a backdrop of color first. They would build their color from that. The good thing about it is it does all the work for you.
Yeah.
I mean, I fumed a lot of furniture pieces before, and I had a bunch of pieces to do for a client once, and I thought, where the hell am I going to fume all this stuff at? I thought, wait a second, I'll just go rent a U-Haul truck, a box truck, and I put it all in there, put plastic on the back, put it in there, and then brought it back the next day to the guy. He goes, it smells really clean in here. I said, yeah, it was a little dirty, so I cleaned it up for you. He goes, oh, well, thank you. I didn't tell him what I'd been doing with it. You figure that was a need-to-know basis, and he didn't need to know.
Use of a rental.
So, but sometimes they would do that first, and then build their color with dyes and or stains to achieve their final color. But the base color, it gives you kind of a grayish, brownish tone, and they would build the color from there. But I've also fumed wood where it has a slight, small amount of finish on it. I've been working on a house in Hollywood Hills for 12 years now.
No.
The contractor goes, I think on all this African mahogany, we're just going to go clear. I thought, I know this client well enough, he's not going to want to go just clear. So I put a very, very thin coat of shellac on, about a ½ pound cut, to where at least it would look like it had some finish on it. Well, the owner came in and goes, you know, I wanted something deeper and richer than that. I said, I kind of thought so, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to fume it. He goes, okay. Explain to me how that works. And I told him. He goes, I'm game. So we sealed up all the doors and windows, put the ammonia in the corners in the house, sealed, did the whole room. It permeated through that very thin coat of shellac and still colored the wood, and then let it off gas for a day. We clear coated it with our polyurethane varnish, a couple of coats, rubbed it out with steel wool and wax, and it looked like $1 million because it creates the color by changing the color of the wood chemically.
Yeah.
And the good thing about it is you don't have to brush anything on. You let the ammonia do all the work for you. So you can fume any kind of wood that has tannic acid. You know, I've fumed all kinds of different woods before.
Where do you get the ammonia?
I buy it from a company in LA, Triple S Chemical.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and you can go right down there. They'll sell you quarts or gallons, whatever the case may be. I buy a lot of my chemicals from Marci.
And you told us in class you can go to a pool supply.
Some of the pool supply companies will sell, they also use ammonia as well. And so you can do that. And that reminds me of an old story. Has anybody ever heard of George Frank before? Well, George Frank was a woodworker and a wood finisher classically trained in Budapest, Hungary. He immigrated to France after World War I, went to work for one of the best finishing houses because he was very, very good. Immigrated to the United States in, I think, 36 and had a shop in New York for a number of years until he retired. He passed away back in I think, 96 at a very old age, and he worked with a lot of these chemicals and ammonia, but he was working for the client's house one time, and he needed a place to fume all this furniture that he made, and he'd go, wait, the swimming pool's emptied right now because they're going to re-plaster. So he put the furniture pieces in there, put ammonia and staged it around there, covered it with a tarp and sealed it, and just used the swimming pool to fume all these pieces. I thought that's pretty genius. Yes. So anyways, any other questions? Yes, sir.
What do you recommend for cleaning cherry cabinets in a kitchen that have fingerprint marks, around all the holes and that?
Is the finish already started to break down?
No, the finish is, was a teak oil or, it was
An oil finish of some type? Okay. Use something, you don't want to use something too strong. I mean, you could use TSP, but that's pretty harsh. You'd probably use something more like Simple Green because it won't hurt the finish, and you can rinse that right off. So Simple Green would be a good way to go.
What if it has already started to break down?
Now, how many people have ever seen kitchen cabinets where it's got a clear top coat finish and all of a sudden it's getting gummy and sticky around?
Yeah.
Well, what happens is the natural oils from your skin will start to break down the finish. So you need to take off that clear coat. The good thing is most commercial cabinetry or stuff that's made commercially, guys are finishing it with nitrocellulose lacquer that was spray applied. Lacquer can be completely removed by taking acetone or lacquer thinner to it. You could wash off just the affected strip, that side of it where the pull is. take the finish off and reshoot new finish on it and be good to go again. Yes, Nick?
How about cabinets that have been sprayed with polyurethane about 25 years ago? They had like a cloudy film.
Has it always had a cloudy film
No,
too?
just in the last 10 years or so.
Okay.
For some reason,
Maybe if the finish is just broken down and
does
it's...
does it give off something after a while that creates this?
No, typically when you get a cloudy film like that, it happens a lot of time with clear finishes when there's a lot of humidity in the air, and it'll happen during the time of application. But the problem with like polyurethane varnish, and it is a varnish, is you have to remove it with a paint and varnish remover and take it off. So it's going to be a little bit of work.
Well, it's going to be cloudy for a while.
Yeah, which means Nick's not going to do that anytime soon. Got it. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Most of us wood turners like to turn not flat material, but round or whatever.
Sure.
So to get a, say, a French polish on anything that's round, you're going to have to put several layers of finish on.
Yeah.
What would you recommend? I've tried shellac, but then I said shellac is very thick liquid.
It is, unless you thin it down. Are you spray applying it yourself? Okay. There was a gentleman that taught at our school for a number of years, Jim Driscoll, and unfortunately he passed away this summer. And Jim took my class one time, so I talked to him about how he finishes his turned pieces like that, especially, vases and things. He goes, I use nitrocellulose lacquer out of a spray can. Because the same kind of lacquer that you buy when you're buying a gallon can, they just thin it out more to where it won't clog up the orifice. And he goes, so what I do is, after I put these different segments of wood together, I'll shoot lacquer sanding sealer, which is a sealer coat that goes on first before your clear final coats go on. He goes, then I sand it back. And what you're doing is eventually you're filling up those, if it's an open pored wood, you're filling it up with that sanding sealer to where when you start putting your clear coats, it has a look like French polishing. And that was how he did it for years and years, and he did some beautiful turnings, did he not, Marci? I mean, he was a pretty gifted turner. Yes, sir?
Now, on flat surface with French polish, you've done the French polish.
Right.
Now, how do you protect that?
No, you put a piece of glass on it.
Exactly.
And yeah. So is everybody familiar with the term French polishing? Okay, some people, for those that have no idea what it is, French polishing is a centuries-old method of actually applying shellac. And the way they do that is, does everybody know what shellac is?
Yes.
Okay, good. So what they do is they take a pad, a core pad, what they would typically use is wool because it holds a fair amount of material. So they soak it in your thinned out shellac. Then they would put a piece of linen, wrap it with linen, fold the corners up and twist it to where you have sort of this egg-shaped ball, and it's nice and flat here. It doesn't have any creases. You take a bottle with denatured alcohol, and it's called charging the pad. You squeeze some of this alcohol on there, you would tap it, and it draws that shellac to the surface. You start and going around the perimeter first, the outside of it, and then you're doing, say, figure eights. You're going back and forth all the way off each side, going figure eights, figure eights, figure eights. So you're applying microscopic amount, very thin amounts of shellac. It's a very labor-intensive method of applying shellac, but it gives a particular look that's really hard to replicate. But lacquer is a fairly good way of replicating it. Now the problem with shellac is, does anybody know the solvent for shellac?
Alcohol.
Denatured alcohol. So what happens if your friends come over and they're sitting there with their scotch and soda, they spill it on the table, well, that alcohol is going to melt into that shellac coat. So shellac, as beautiful as it is, it's not a finish that I would probably want to use on a dining table because it's too susceptible to having alcohol spilled on it again and melting right into it. Now, the good thing about both shellac and lacquer is they're easy finishes to fix. I showed somebody the other day in class that I teach at Cerritos. They had bubbles in their clear coat on their lacquer because they did just what I told them not to do. They put it out in the sun to get it to dry. Don't want to do that. What happens is you get something called solvent entrapment. With shellac and lacquer finishes, the solvent has to evaporate through a wet film. If you put it in the sun, it skims over too quickly. That solvent is going to come out eventually, and it's going to sort of dry the surface and leave bubbles. So I said, let it dry, and we took a single-edge razor blade and scraped it. So you're taking these peaks and knocking it down. You can see a little bit of the scratch marks from the razor blade. I said, now we're going to take a pad. We're going to make a pad almost like French polishing, and we're going to dip it into acetone, and we're going to basically French polish this and take any of those marks out. Well, you can fix a problem where you've had with the French polish by using alcohol to do that with, or if it's lacquer, you can make the pad and use acetone or lacquer thinner. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, sir.
You ever use beeswax as a first coat?
I've used beeswax before, and a lot of times I'll tint it and use it like a liming wax. So I'll put the beeswax, I'll put color in it, I'll melt it down in a double boiler. Yeah, and add colorant to it like artist oils that you can buy at Michael's or Dick Blick. Add whatever color you want to it, let it solidify again, put the wax on first, especially on an open-grained wood like oak or mahogany, and then you can take the excess wax off and just leave it into the open grain. And you could put like a coat of shellac over that or lacquer over that, and it will adhere to it. I'm getting all choked up just talking about this. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Will the lacquer adhere to the wax?
Here's what I usually do. If I'm going to do like a beeswax with color in it like that first, like a liming type of wax, I'll use a vinyl sealer. And lacquer vinyl sealer will adhere to woods that are either have wax in them or natural oils in them, like rosewood. Different woods like that, tulip wood, have natural oils in it that's hard for a finish to adhere to. Oh, thank you. Vinyl sealer is really good for that. Or shellac is really good for that. Has anybody ever heard of the product? Yes, sir.
No, go ahead.
No, the product Seal Coat.
Yeah, sure.
So Seal Coat is made by the Zinsser company, and Zinsser has taken over the market of shellac. They knocked out their competition, which used to be Xeron. And how do you knock out your competition? You buy them out and then you just get rid of them. Now you don't have any competition. Michael Dresner, wood finisher, who's written several books himself, worked with Zinsser and created a method to take the wax out of the shellac that naturally comes from the insect. The problem with waxy shellac, if you go to Home Depot and you see it, it'll say clear shellac. Think perfect, it's clear shellac. Nowhere on the label does it tell you that there's wax in that shellac. And that's one of the problems with the finishing industry. There's a lot of non-information, and it makes it hard for people. It's like, well, what exactly is this product, and how exactly does it work? And God help you if you ask somebody at Home Depot for help. They're going to go, what's shellac? What aisle is it in? So they developed a way to take the shellac out of what naturally comes from the insect itself. That way you can top coat it with a waterborne top coat, solvent-based top coats, and so that's one of the reasons they developed de-wax clear shellac, and it's a 2-pound cut shellac.
Everything sticks to shellac.
Everything, yeah. Shellac is a great, that's why they call it a universal sealer right on the can, because it really is. You can put a lot of different finishes over shellac and they'll be compatible. Anybody else?
But you can't put an oil finish over shellac.
No, but you could put shellac over an oil finish. So if you wanted, let's say you had a highly figured wood like bird's eye maple, and you really want to get the figure to pop, but you're not going to necessarily put any other synthetic form of color. So what I'll do is I'll put either a coat of tung oil or boiled linseed oil and really get the eyes to pop on it, let it dry overnight, wipe off all that excess, and then I'll put a coat of shellac on it and get some sheen to it, and then maybe top coat that with lacquer, because the shellac will stick to that oil finish. And that's one of the real great things about shellac. It is a real problem solver. Anybody else? All right. Yes?
You know, I hate finishes.
Do you? Yeah, me too. I don't know why I got into this business.
I'm lazy. And so basically I tend to...
You're very honest.
I am. When I make bowls, which I don't do all that often, I'm concerned concerned obviously about toxicity.
Sure.
I had and I tend to just seal my board with wall, straight walnut on.
Okay.
Anything else. But I had a discussion with somebody the other day about off-gassing, because it's a nut, tree nut, blumpy nut.
Sure.
Blah, blah, blah. When the oil is cured, it's cured.
That's right.
So there's nothing coming off.
That's right.
Okay.
I
heard it from the horse's mouth.
But that's the real misnomer. They'll say, well, no, you can't use boiled linseed oil because it has those heavy metal dryers in it. Have you ever seen a product that Watco makes called salad bowl finish? You know what's in that? It's got varnish and it's got boiled linseed oil and it's got paint thinner. Well, it's like, wait a second. Then how can the government say that's okay to use? The FDA doesn't have a problem with that because once that oil has cured, to your point, it is non-toxic. It's just a misnomer that's been spread for so long. It's like anything. You repeat something long enough and it's like, well, it must be true. I've heard it and Joe over here heard it and it's just not true. But speaking of coloring the wood and you're concerned about toxicity, in the book there's a company that I use for dyes called Articol dyes, Artie dyes. They make some toy maker dyes that are completely non-toxic dyes. And when I've talked to different woodworkers before in associations, and that a lot of times at Christmas time they'll make toys and give them away to underprivileged kids, it's a non-toxic product that you can use. You could finish it with shellac because shellac is non-toxic as well. They used to finish kids' toys with it. They still use shellac. Have you ever taken a vitamin before that has a coating that makes it easier to swallow? That's shellac. Candy makers, confectioners still use shellac. M&Ms used to be coated with shellac. So apples, when you see them in the store and they're all nice and shiny, they don't sit there and polish those with a lamb's wool pad to get them that shiny. They put a coat of shellac on it because guess what? It also acts as a preservative because it helps keep oxygen out. And it gives it that nice sheen to it. Let's face it, we're all drawn to that sheen like moths do a light, right? You see, oh, it's nice and shiny. So, yes, sir.
So I've done a lot of projects over the years, and I've always used Watco oil.
Sure. Yeah. Easy.
So, what I've noticed is that over the years, there's no shine at all in this.
No.
Even though I buffed it with wax back then, it's basically dull now.
Yeah.
I could shellac over the top of that.
Sure you could.
And spray lacquer.
You absolutely could do that. Clean it first, make sure it's good and clean.
Right.
But yeah, you could put a coat of shellac or you could put a coat of vinyl lacquer sealer over that and then go to your...
I've never heard of vinyl lacquer.
Yeah, vinyl lacquer sanding sealer. It's a different resin than it is standard nitrocellulose resin. The vinyl has the ability to stick to that, but you could use the shellac is fine, absolutely fine, then switch to lacquer. Yes, sir?
Oh, go ahead.
Oh.
You would recommend that the shellac that does not have the wax in it?
Yeah, you buy the seal coat. Rockler sells it. Home Depot used to sell them. For whatever reason, they don't anymore because I don't think enough people were buying it, so they just decided not to sell it.
That great company called Osh. Oh, wait a minute.
Oh, wait, they're out of business. Oh, yes.
They used to sell it.
They did used to sell it, yeah. Yes, sir?
I make briar pipe. I smoke a tobacco pipe. And I'm wondering about that. I don't really have anything to get I use the 3 wax, the Triple E, and the White Diamond, and the Carnauba. But I've seen some pipes that are really, really high gloss. And I was wondering, is what you're talking about with those, when they're reheated with fire, will they become toxic or will they just break down? Yeah,
they'll break down. So what I do is when I'm trying to do a finish like that where I want to buff it out and get a nice degree of sheen to it, I buy the Carnauba wax myself that it has nothing but pure Carnauba. And the nice thing about that is it buffs to a high degree of sheen because it dries much, much harder than does beeswax. When you buy a ready-made wax, it's typically going to have a small percentage of Carnauba in it to give it a little sheen to it, and then it's going to have beeswax because it's a softer wax and it makes it easier for the applicator to put it on and buff it off. With Carnauba, it dries very hard, so you have to put it on thin and do small amounts and then buff it, but you can buff it to a really high degree of sheen, so that may be a way to go. Anybody else? Yes, sir?
I have knotty pine
Mm-hmm.
in the kitchen.
Yeah.
I have a strip of this type of wood. Do you have any recommendations? Because it's old, so it's now yellow, orange, like matching dye match or anything like that.
So you need to match some new to the old?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so a way to do that, you'd want to, they may have finished it originally with amber shellac, or orange shellac as they used to call it. There's methods of using dyes like trans-tint dyes where you can get a color that's effectively going to match that. You don't want to use stains because stains are nothing more than pigment, like they use in house paint. The darker the stain color, the more pigment they put in. The more pigment they put in, the less of the grain you read. But if you go to Rockler, you can buy trans-tint dyes, and what this is a dye matter that's dissolved into glycol ether. Now the good thing about glycol ether, it's also used in your car for antifreeze. But it's soluble into water, it's soluble into alcohol, and it's soluble into acetone. So I use them sometimes in clear coats for toning, or I'll use them as a straight dye. I just finishing some work for the Getty right now. A friend of mine made a bunch of bookcases for one of the offices, and it was all curly maple rather. And I use trans-tint dye, and I put it into 1 part acetone and 1 part alcohol, and I spray applied it because I can get it to flash off really quick. And if you've ever tried to finish maple before, maple and cherry are 2 of the most difficult woods to try to put color on. Even though they're both hardwoods, they both have parts of the surface that are more porous than other parts, and they tend to be blotch prone. If you spray apply them though, then you can get them to flash off just as they hit the surface. But with the pine, you can probably just put it into water and it'll be absolutely fine. But what I do is if I'm using a water-based dye or a water-based clear coat, I'll raise the grain first. I'll put clean water on it, and I always use distilled water just because I don't want the chlorine to affect. Certain woods will turn a certain color because of the chlorine. So I use distilled water. Sponge it on there or wipe it on, let it dry. Whatever grit, what grit do you typically like to sand to? 220, 320? Okay, yeah, I don't go past 320 personally. Lightly sand it with 320 just to knock off those raised wood fibers, dust it off, and then you can put your dye color on it. Just experiment. Now here's the thing, when you're making dyes too, when the sample piece is wet with the dye, that's going to simulate what it looks like with clear finish on it. And that's when you want to hold it next to the piece that does have clear finish and go, okay, I'm pretty close at this point. Once the water evaporates out, it's going to dry probably 2 shades lighter, so that's not going to give you a good representation of how it's going to look finished. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
I'm seeing a lot of use of waxes with abrasives in it. Your comment?
What kind of abrasives?
Well, Yorkshire grit. What's that? Like Yorkshire grit? Yorkshire grit. There's a
Triple A.
Oh, trip. Okay.
Are they effective?
Be honest with you, I haven't really used those, so it would be hard for me to actually comment on that. So, yeah. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Yeah, would you talk a little about using wood conditioners prior to staining?
Yeah, so, has anybody ever, obviously people have stained wood before, right? And if you put it on softer woods like fir, pine, alder, they're very soft woods. They will be very blotchy because the parts of the surface are much more porous. So like Minwax makes something called wood conditioner. Well, you know what I use for wood conditioner? I use shellac, that seal coat. I will thin it down. It's a 2-pound cut in the can, the way it comes. I'll thin it down more than that to maybe even a ½ pound or a 1-pound cut. And I'll put that on and use that as a wash coat. Because if you've ever read the instruction on those wood conditioners, you have to stain the wood within a certain amount of time. That's because it's wet with that wood conditioner and it's going to help take color more evenly. The shellac, you can let it dry overnight or for a week. And then go, it's late, I don't want to do any more work today, and you can go back in the morning and give it a light sand and put your stain color on it. So I use shellac as a way to control the blotchiness and porosity of the wood. Yes, sir?
Have you ever used just glue size?
Yeah, I do that all the time. Elmer's white glue and water. It makes a wonderful size, and what I do is I'm working on a Lloyd Wright house right now in Los Feliz. And I did the original restoration in 2006 for the previous owner, and we just ended up redoing the house on the outside now for the new owner. And we took off all the old finish that we had put on it because they let it go way too long. And cleaned it up and kept all the original patina that I put on it back when I did it. But some of the boards want to take color very unevenly, so I take Elmer's white glue. The beautiful thing about Elmer's as a glue or as a pre-wood conditioner it dries very, very clear. It doesn't have any kind of an amber color to it. So I'll typically use a ratio of, say, 4 parts glue to 1 part water, or maybe 2 parts water to 1 part glue, depending on how soft of a wood it is. You put that on, let it dry. As soon as the water evaporates out, it's pretty much dry. Give it a light sand, and then put your clear finish or your color over that, and it will take much more evenly. Yes, sir?
Sorry, go back to shellac again.
Yeah.
Whenever you say shellac, are you saying seal coat, not?
Yeah, I prefer, okay, so here's why I use the seal coat, but here's when I would use the shellac that has wax in it. Let's say I have a piece of furniture at home that's just a sideboard. It's all lace wood. And so I dyed it with Mohawk dye when I first got the piece, because I got it unfinished from a friend of mine. And I dyed it to match my dining table at the time, and I finished it with amber shellac with the wax in it, because the only finish I was going to use was just shellac. And so it's perfectly fine to use the waxy shellac if you're not going to top coat it with any other type of finish. But if I'm going to top coat it with, say, a waterborne finish, clear coat like Minwax polyacrylic, or I'm going to spray lacquer, or I'm going to wipe on a thin coat of polyurethane varnish, then I'll use the seal coat, because it doesn't have wax and it'll be compatible with my next finish.
Okay, so preferably use
Seal.
seal coat when you're ready, because I've been
Yeah.
using this other stuff all the time.
Yeah. Yeah, buy the seal coat. I think you'll like it. It's pretty easy to work
A
with.
friend of mine gave me some of it, and I really like it.
Okay, the shellac or the seal coat?
Seal coat.
Now here's the thing with ready-made shellac as well. It's got a shelf life of about 3 years.
Right.
Because what happens after that, because in denatured alcohol there's a percentage of water in it, and that will cause the shellac to go bad. If you want to get longer life out of it, you could buy the flakes yourself, buy 200 proof alcohol and make up your own shellac that way, but that's a lot of work and it's very expensive, quite honestly. So does anybody know what's in denatured alcohol versus, say, 200 proof alcohol? They put methanol in it, and methanol is poisonous, and that way it can't be consumed, and it's taxed at a much lower rate. And so that's why they put the methanol in it. Anybody else? Any other questions? Then I'm going to wrap it up and let you good folks go home. Thank you so much for having Marci and I today. Thank you.